Welcome back. This is lecture 42, the last formal lecture for art. We're looking at a variety of challenging types of art making in this final lecture. We're looking at performance. Specifically, you want to watch out for the work of Joseph Beuys. The piece to know for the test is Coyote. Installation sculpture, we'll look at the work Keinholz. We'll also look at conceptual art. A good example of conceptual photography would be the work of Cindy Sherman. We'll also look at sculpture being made with video and with light. And we'll end with looking at some examples of things that are going on in the 2000s that are challenging in their own right in terms of their content. So performance art is a difficult subject people to understand because on one level it seems like maybe it should be classified in another category. Some people imagine that it should be classified with theater. However, there are a variety of differences. First of all, a performance art piece is meant to be, although it is performed an audience involved in some way, the piece is meant to be primarily a visual experience. And you could argue certainly that is the case for an art form such as the ballet or formal performances in dance. However, the majority of performances in dance do tend to be highly choreographed, rather specific, and the performances to be essentially the same each time that they are presented. The same is true for scripted theater. There's a script, the actors parts and speak the same lines, the same dialogue. That is all controlled to a certain extent by the director, and each performance is meant to be more or less the same each time the piece is performed. With performance art, on the other hand, we have much more. Also have the fact that most of the time the person who is in charge of organizing the project or the experience, who you might equate with the choreographer or with the author of the play or with the director, is the artists themselves, and most of the time they are involved. But more often than not, there is some degree of audience participation in these experiences as well. And so they are hybrid of lots of other aspects of art making. They can have elements of painting, elements of sculpture, elements of dance, elements of sound. Approach the combination of those ideas in a way that no other art form actually is able to do. So they fit easily into the category of music or theatrical performance or dance. And in some ways it sits a little bit aside from or from painting, but primarily is a visual shared experience. So these began in America in the 60s, were referred to at the time as happenings, and that was the name that Alan Caprow used for his pieces. This is some documentaries that show some aspects of one of his most famous pieces, performance pieces from the 60s called Household. Now, the piece does baffling when you hear it described, but basically he divided his participants / audience into two groups by gender. The men that you see on the left-hand side, the women, while the men were building this, created an object out of trash that looked kind of like a. Then the two groups attacked each other's creations and destroyed them. So quite clearly he was making a statement about both visually the conflicts between the two genders. The last aspect of the performance involved the participants licking and cleaning jam off a white VW Volkswagen Bug car, which is very egg-shaped. If you know what a bug looks like, they look a lot like that. So you could argue that that became kind of a symbol for birth in some respects. So the piece by the name of Household to do with what it means to create a household, to create this kind of reproduction of human life and this kind of endless between opposing members of a household group. Now, whether we think that that is profound or stupid or our own personal right to have those opinions, but the idea behind making a performance, I think, more than anything, is to create something that is unique and expressive and that causes people who participate in it or to see it or who hear about it to ask. Much like the other art that we'll look at in this final lecture, most of what performance art does is not provide answers, but to provide good questions. There's a boys piece to know for the test is called Coyote, and it's also a pretty notorious and fairly famous performance piece. Now, Boys was in the German military in the Second World War. His fighter plane was shot down, and he described how he was kind of rescued. Him in a fairly remote village, used animal fat to help soothe the burns and so forth on his body. So he very often used animal fat and the felt blankets that they used to keep him alive in his performances and his work later. He wrote a fact that because he almost died, he had kind of symbolically been reborn, and so he used his art as a way of behaving like a shaman or a holy man, somehow trying to be a conduit for the rest of us between this life and something spiritual about what it means to be alive. So in the performance piece Coyote, he actually had a wild coyote that had been captured somehow, placed in an art gallery. It was secure behind a sort of cage wall. It wasn't going to harm anybody, but he had himself delivered to this gallery and placed inside of this enormous cage with the coyote for days, and managed to actually come to a place where he and the coyote were able to coexist. So the subtitle for this piece, I think, is actually more interesting than its original title. He subtitled it, "I Like America and America Likes." The coyote kind of is a symbol for the wildness of the New World from a European point of view. Certainly you could make the illusion that the coyote represents a spiritual figure in a lot of Native American traditions. The coyote can be a trickster character, force that may not be entirely good or bad. And so coming to terms with it in some ways might be healing some of the wounds within the history of the country itself. It's kind of a remarkable achievement. You can see how dangerous it was in that shot as he interacts with the coyote, and you can see in these series of shots by the bottom row there, bottom left, you can see that they've really come into a place of peace. So kind of an intriguing performance there. Now, just like any other art form, there are pieces that might speak to you, that might seem to have a message or a meaning that you're interested in, and there's others that you might not. This particular artist is one who I'm not a huge fan of, but he certainly got famous for some of the risks that he took in his work, including willingly being shot at. That's the image you see on the far right. He, in a gallery, had a friend who was a sharp in the arm, which of course creates a statement about gun violence, etc. The part that always intrigued me, though, is this photograph of people in the gallery, this woman with her hands kind of on her hips, looking on like, I'm experiencing art, right? Kind of an odd way to go about making a statement. Some of the artists in the performance movement were influenced or were interested in another art movement that happened in the 60s. This movement, and the flux artists really were trying to break down some of the barriers between different cultures, different languages, different nationalities, but also the idea that art, again, was some sort of elite thing that only certain people were allowed to have or to make. So you could actually order flux kits from their catalog, and they would ship you materials to make your own art from. So you would have high quality art in your home, your own creation, as opposed to having to pay an artist to go out and purchase something that they had already made. Yoko Ono is perhaps one of the most famous members of she's still active as a performance artist today. Her perhaps most iconic piece, this is Yoko Ono's piece from 1964, called the Cut piece. She has performed this even into her 70s, but the idea behind the piece is really kind of provocative. It's terribly difficult in terms of the amount of materials needed. She sits on a stage. Nowadays she sits in a chair if she performs it, beside a pair of shears. And the audience are invited to come on stage and to snip away and cut away at the clothing until she becomes kind of an object. And as the participant or as the audience member, you are complicit in this idea of woman as object of beauty and all of the different kind of ramifications, political, sexual, all of those ideas are really what the piece is all about. And so again, it's not that she tells you what to think as much as that she provokes thought and response from you. There are an enormous number of artists whose artwork from the later half of the 20th century into the 21st really is about provoking a conversation. And quite often they're about issues of equality versus inequality. So as we move into the idea of installation, sculpture made of multiple pieces, generally occupying a fairly large amount of space that requires the viewer to move in and around and through to really experience. Now the work of Judy Chicago. Judy Chicago actually changed her last name. She had a very heavy Chicago accent, and so she town rather than to have a husband's name or her father's name to kind of emphasize her own individuality. So she's very much a feminist. She also does some things with this piece that are kind of unusual. She didn't make every single thing that you see here in this piece called The Dinner Party. In fact, she employed dozens of other women to help make the objects, potters, weavers, etc., to make place settings, both the cups, etc., the tablecloth. All of these are meant to be place settings for famous women throughout history. So it's set up as a triangle. One side of the table is for women from prehistoric times through the time of Rome. The second side is for the rise of Christianity through the Reformation. There's a place setting there for Artemisia Gentileschi. The third side would be from the American Revolution till the day the peace was a place setting for Georgia O'Keeffe. You can also see here, I'll bring my mouse in, you can see on the bottom names of multiple other women. In making the research for this piece, she discovered that she had so many more significant historically important women who changed the world that she wanted to include, that she would never be able to finish the piece or have the financial resources to make enough place settings. Anyone who she was unable to include has their name on these tiles that occupy the entire floor. So in a way, you could almost argue that there are far more women represented than the mere 39 that are having formal place settings at the table itself. That gives you a clip that shows the place setting for Virginia Woolf here on the yellow. Installation sculpture quite frequently involves assemblage of found multiple pieces of other objects found or scavenged from the environment to create an object that speaks to us. This is the work of Ed and Nancy Keinholz. A lot of the earlier pieces are only credited to Edward's name. He said retroactively that really pieces since the time that he and Nancy became married should be credited to both of them, that they had worked as a team. So pieces were both Keinholz's. The piece to know for the test is called the State Hospital, and it's an installation that if you walked up to it, you would see what you see here on the left, this kind of closed room, Ward 19, with a locked and barred door, and if you look through the window in the door, you would see these figures. This is meant to represent a state mental institution, mental hospital, and it speaks a lot about the inequities of our mental health care system prior to the modern age. Not that things are perfect now, but patients are not treated as harshly or as insensitively as they were in the 50s and 60s. So you see here that our mental patient has been restrained to the bed and in such a depressed state that the only thing he can think or talk about is the situation that he's in. So it's not meant to be roommates as much as it is to show you the mental figure is only able to think about the situation and the horrible aspect of it. To make it less depressing, we can look at installation sculpture that has a bit of a sense of humor. This is the work of Sandy Skoglin. Skoglin's work involves posing living people in these tableaux, in these rooms. Museums are able to purchase the sets, obviously not the people in them, or authorized photographs of the pieces with the figures in them, either or. These are from the 80s. My favorite one really is the one at the upper left, Revenge of the Gold. Every goldfish that you ever flushed down a toilet came back to you. It's kind of an interesting piece there. Mike Kelly is a really kind of cutting-edge installation sculptor who uses unusual things. In this case, he's using stuffed animals and toys that were collected from like restores, thrift stores, places like the Salvation Army, those types of places. They're all kids' toys, and the name of the piece that you see the photograph of here is More Love Hours Than Can Ever Be Repaid. If you think about the amount of love that children have for their outgrow them, you imagine if those toys were living things, right? How much love is embedded in them is kind of the idea behind that piece. Fred Wilson takes us from installation to truly conceptual art because he doesn't actually make anything. But what Fred Wilson does that's so remarkable is he takes collections that already exist and rearranges the objects to provide a different context for understanding those objects. So he does this with the permission of the various museums who invite him to do this work. The most compelling ones are these, I think, over here on the right-hand side of the screen. He allowed to rearrange objects within a museum to put both the fine pewter and silver from a plantation, the slave shackles from that same plantation. So it creates a really compelling statement about the work that had to be done to earn the money to have these things and who did that work. So very simply, without really making an enormous amount of words to explain the idea, this presentation was simply called metalwork. What you see below it is simply titled woodwork. So these fine chairs are arranged almost like an audience, looking for a training post for a whipping post. Conceptual art by its very nature is often provocative, makes you think, because often than not, conceptual art does not have an actual physical end product. Sometimes conceptual art is just ideas or just words. And so what Jenny Holtz does is to use the technology of the day, those LED lights that we're confronted with in marquees that tell you what movies are being played at what time, or constant running ticker at the stock market. Those types of things are the tools that she tends to use. Jenny Holzer's work could be generally classified all into a large series known as the truisms. They're just true statements, or true from her particular point of view. I think this one is really pretty provocative. Protect me from what I want is a statement that is definitely kind of one that makes question the ultimate meaning behind it. And then the more you think about it, sometimes the things we want are dangerous for us, right? You might want much, or you might want to drink too much, or you might want to have a cigarette, or you might want to do any number of things that could cause you physical or emotional harm or illness. And so sometimes the very things that we want to do are the things that we should most avoid. So it's kind of an intriguing series of statements from her. This is the work of Joseph Kossuth, and Kossuth's art, I think, is really pretty amazing. He presents quite often in this particular series an actual of that object or one very similar to it, and a textbook dictionary definition of what the object itself is, which does kind of make you question whether the image of the chair or the word and its meaning, or the actual thing are truly different from one another, or if in a strange way they are all one and the same thing. Barbara Kruger is a conceptual artist who uses images from found sources from pop culture combined with text that quite often is really ironic, and that text is often very bold, and it looks coming to you perhaps from an advertising agency, but with these kind of statements that really make you stop and question what you're seeing. One of her most famous, of course, is "Your body is a battleground." Pretty loaded message there. Cindy Sherman's work is photography, clearly, but she classifies it as conceptual photography, and more often than not, she is actually the person in most of her images. She became famous for the series that you see here, Untitled Film Stills, in which she seems to portray different sort of stock archetypal or even stereotype female characters from movies, and you get a feeling that she is presenting her same body through this lens of how we perceive each other based on clothing and setting and attitude. Perhaps my favorite pair really are these two, number 7 and number 35. Number 7 got a cigarette in one hand, she's got a martini in the other, she's kind of staggering out of her what looks to be a swanky apartment toward a pool. This, but she's clearly playing two different parts. This character seems to be kind of the American hard work hometown or farm girl rising up from a difficult past. We make assumptions about these women and about their stories. They're made up, the situations are made up based purely on the way she presents them. So it really does cause us to kind of question what we're seeing. There are a lot of artists who've used technology, of course, since the beginnings of making art. And artists now are using more and more digital and video technologies. Namjoon Paik, who's a member of the Flux movement, began to make literal sculptures out of discarded videos, etc., and began to use video in his work in that way. And there are plenty of artists who are actually shooting video and presenting them, usually in gallery settings. So we're not really talking about music videos, which, as wonderful as they are, and I'm a huge fan of music videos, don't get me wrong, but they are really kind of designed to make us buy the person's music, either buy tickets to the concert or to buy downloads of the music albums, if that's still a thing, I don't know. Bill Viola, on the other hand, uses the video camera to create really very often slow motion movement, reference other artworks, as in this piece, you see that he's recreating this meeting, the visitation, which is the visitation between Mary and her cousin Elizabeth, who is pregnant with John the Baptist. Mary's obviously pregnant with Christ. And so we start to see these women in sort of contemporary 1980s, 90s clothing as if they are related to these women from the classical past. Viola also created a really famous piece, The Cross, in which he seems to walk through fire and to walk through water. There's also a piece of his in the North Carolina Museum, which was completed in the year 2000. And I gave you two really bad screen grabs of it, but it is a very slow motion video, which when you see it in person doesn't really seem to be moving. Unless you stand there and watch for a while, you see that very, very slowly the 5 actors in the video begin to slightly alter their positions and gestures. It feels very much like looking at a Baroque painting come to life. It's pretty remarkable. My personal favorite of the video artists working in the latter 20th to the 21st is Tony Ersler, who uses projection of video onto unusual objects. So something like a blinking eye projected onto a sphere is kind of typical of what he does. There have been, since the 60s, artists using different approaches to what sculpture can be. Sculpture is really about changing three-dimensional space. We can do that with light. So Dan Flavin became one of the most well-known artists of the 60s, who used fluorescent tubes to create sculptures that altered space through projection of light. Now, is art or bad? Is just breaking rules just something to get famous and to make money? Well, artists have done that for a long time. But here are some examples of art of began to make people angry about the modern art scene, or sorry, postmodern art scene. This is the work of Mark Quinn. He at the time was a British sculptor, and he created a self-portrait by making a mold of his own head and then filling it with a liquid that when would become hard. Well, we do that with molten metal most of the time. In this case, he used his own blood. Now you can imagine that people were pretty horrified. Just saying sculpture made of blood is going to really trigger some people just by the description alone. It is certainly something that was going to get people's attention, and it did. This exhibition of this work in America was known as the Sensations Show. Rudy Giuliani was mayor of New York at the time, and he really hated it and tried to get it shut down. So the idea of this piece obviously is a bit about shocking you, but on reflection, one thing I do actually kind of like about it is that Quinn made art about himself, which is kind of intriguing. And also the contract, if anybody purchased the piece, which it did sell to the Saatchi family, who is the world's largest advertising firm. They're based out of London. The contract stated that the piece would have to be remade, and so he actually, that's what it looked like originally. He's since had to remake it as he himself has aged, and you can see he's gotten a little heavier, his face has changed significantly over time, so he's really still committed to making this idea of making art out of his own body. David Hirst is an artist whose name you may know. He's certainly become well known, or became well known in the 90s, for sculptures that were embalmed animals. The one at the top is the one that I kind of like. It is titled "The Impossibility of Death in the Mind." Obviously, a shark could harm you, if not outright kill you. It's terrifying, but to see it in this context, you're safe, you know it can't get it. It does sort of provoke an interesting idea. The stuff that made him really famous, though, was kind of designed, I think, to shock us. So there were pieces that he made where he bisected farm animals and put them in two separate containers so you could walk in between and see the interior of the body, kind of shocking. Also inspired a scene in 2000's The Cell, starring Jennifer Lopez, in which a horse is sliced by falling glass and she has to walk in between it. So again, perhaps the shocking things will, in some ways, have impact in other areas of our culture. There's another artist from the Sensations show who definitely would be someone whose work would trigger you if you heard that an image of the Virgin Mary was made also involving elephant feces. You would think, oh, this is horrifying, until you discover that the artist is biracial and cultural. So he's paying homage to cultural, religious traditions, both from one side of his family and from the other. There were other in that show that really shocked people, such as this one, which appears to be dismembered bodies. It's very realistically painted. If you think back, though, last unit, we already saw that image as a print in Goya's Disasters of War. So I think one thing that the artists who created the second piece, brothers, what they're really doing in some respects is shocking us about things that we've become accustomed to. If I show you Goya's Disasters of War, not so horrifying, but the sculpture itself feels more real to us in the late 20th, early 21st century. So it's reminding us what it takes for us to recognize human reality. A very notorious event that took place in American art was a controversy about the artwork of Robert Mapplethorpe. Mapplethorpe was a fairly famous photographer who died from complications from AIDS, HIV, and he was honored after his death with a retrospective, an most important works. And so this exhibition was organized, and it included works from all points in his career, some of which were very sexualized, and the image I've included there is one that gives you sort of a hint of how extreme they could be. Some of them are more extreme than that. But the imagery was not really objected to by people when the show traveled to a couple of different locations. It actually opened, scheduled to open rather, at the Corcoran in DC. That became a little bit of too much of a hot button issue, so it actually opened in Hartford, Connecticut. It then traveled to Berkeley, California. But then when it got to Cincinnati, Ohio, they actually managed to shut the show down. Director was taken away from the museum gallery in handcuffs on pornography charges. And so it created an enormous debate about where the line is in terms of what makes something art versus something offensive to everyone. So when the court case came along, one of the people who were in support of the work of Mapplethorpe and its exhibition thought that they could use as a successful argument was First Amendment, that we have the right to freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, and so that was one argument they wanted to use. They all used these excerpts from the National Foundation on the Arts and Humanities Act from 1965. It's essentially the act of Congress that establishes the National Endowment for the Arts. So, not that I'll read you the entire thing, but it's interesting to think of this as our elected, chose and voted for, meeting together to decide what the government should do for us as citizens in regard to arts. And so one of the things that's really important, I think, about what the government wrote to itself in this act of Congress is that the humanities belong to all of us. But point 3, that any advanced civilization shouldn't limit its efforts only to science and technology, other scholarly and cultural activities to achieve a better understanding of the past, better analysis of the present, better view of the future. They also included within the verbiage of this act of Congress that no government can create a great art into existence, it says, but that it's necessary and appropriate for the government to help create and sustain a climate that encourages freedom and inquiry, and also the material conditions that would facilitate the release of that creative talent. So I think that the government is reminding us over and over again that we have the right to disagree with each other, we have the right to like or not a variety of different ideas or ways of expression, but that we have the freedom to explore those is really pretty essential. So the people who to Mapplethorpe's work really thought that they would be able to lean more on attacking the work as being pornographic. An official court statement, this was from an actual court case, Miller versus State of California, which sort of established for us in 1973 an official line about the difference between pornography and other forms of expression. So point 2, the average person applying temporary community standards had to be considered as a way of defining what crossed or did not cross the line. They went right past point number 1, which was that yes, something, a statement, an image could be offensive, but when as a whole, does it have serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value? And so ultimately, in this court case, even though didn't like the work, still didn't like it at the end of the day, the people who were on the jury were specifically not people who had taken art or art appreciation. They were not involved in the arts in any way. They did not like the work, and many of them spoke after the court case was over. They said, I hated photographs when I first saw them. I never want to see them again. However, I don't have the right to say that he can't make work about his life and his experience. And was going through the AIDS crisis at its absolute worst point, those objects, his record of his own experience, really quite important to understanding the impact of that disease and that political climate as well. So does it have cultural value even if you don't like it? Absolutely. That brings us then to thinking about the difference between the work that he showed that had a sexual image and the work that didn't. He showed images that were sexual, images that were not. And he even divided his own work into two categories. The more sexually explicit things went into the X portfolio, and the non-sexual images were put in the Y portfolio. So he also is showing you that his life is not all about just one thing, that people are an amalgamation of all of the experiences that they have. Now, that being said, you might hate his work, and that's all well and good, but think about how many times in before have we looked at art that really challenged what art could be and challenged a system that said art do one thing. The painting that you see at the top left, the Luncheon on the Grass by Manet, allowed us to have the Impressionist movement. Rules of what the Art Academy said was good. The painting at the right is blobs of paint that certainly were inspirational, I'm sure, on some level, the abstract expressionists, but because Whistler dared to do that, he got in trouble with art critics who said he was doing the wrong thing, and we talked a lot about court case. So are there still artists pushing the boundaries of taste? I wanted to give you at least one example from the 2000s that's an artist who does things that hard to swallow, and I wonder if this might be a piece that later down the line people will look back and say, aha, this changed our ideas or our dialogue about art. This is the work of Wim Delvoye, who makes arguably sculpture, primarily three-dimensional works. One were designs that he had tattooed onto pigs. The pigs lived natural lives, but when they died, they were taxidermied. Someone who bought the work owned a taxidermy pig with his designs tattooed on them. You could certainly bring in questions of animal cruelty to that piece, I imagine. He's also known for the piece Cloaca at the right, which is a machine that replicates the process of breaking down food into solid, essentially, that is able to poop. It's a challenging idea as to whether that is a scientific experiment, whether it's just made to provoke you and make you incredibly angry. So artists have definitely pushed buttons before, and they're still doing it. Though I think are also using their artwork increasingly to make statements about their own personal experiences, and that brings us to girls. They spell their name as if it's spelled the way we spell guerrilla warfare, but they dress events with gorilla masks, which is kind of funny. But they're known best as conceptual artists as a group because they use text, advertising, billboard posters, stickers, etc. to get their point across. The image you see at the bottom is Angst Odalisque, but with a gorilla mask on it, and with the statistics that they were able to calculate, less than 3% of the artists in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the largest art museum in this country, are women artists, but 83% of the nudes in the entire museum are female bodies. It definitely makes you question who has the power in that scenario. My personal favorite piece of theirs is this one, the being a woman artist. This is the ultimate in an ironic statement because they are clearly not saying that these are good things, but they're showing how the art world treats women differently than men. For example, an advantage for a woman artist, working without the pressure of success, or not being stuck in a tenured teaching position, having the opportunity to choose between a career or motherhood. These kind of statements really do kind of that it is perhaps still an unlevel playing field between male and female artists. Certainly, into the 21st century, we have the advantage of seeing artists who are able to make work at a large scale that definitely provokes public. Certainly the case with Kara Walker. Kara Walker was invited to create temporary installation sculpture in a disused sugar factory, and she to create this enormous statue that replicates a sphinx, but combined with kind of a stereotypical African American face, kind of like an Aunt Jemima type character. Very, very provoking, right? She also made images of children out of the so they actually began to melt over time. So this was a piece that talked about slavery. It talked about objectification of women's bodies. Definitely one of the most notorious, iconic, talked about, discussed, challenging pieces of the 20s. Mickalene Thomas is also an African-American female artist, and a lot of what she does in her paintings and sculptural installations to reference art history. There's the Déjeuner sur l'herbe re-envisioned as if they were African-American women in those poses. Changes the context, changes the content. This is how art is always looking back to the past in order to think about how to move into the future. That piece is from 2009. Another piece definitely takes a reference from the past and pushes it to the future. What if we replace Napoleon with kind of an African-American style man in a amalgamation of clothing here that references modern military attire, sort of, but as a fashion statement as opposed to a military statement? Wiley's Napoleon Leading the Army from 2005. And then I wanted to end with an artist who definitely has had a global impact. This perhaps the most famous artist to emerge from China. This is the artist Ai Weiwei, who has done an enormous number of different styles of work in photography, performance, and especially in sculpture. And he's standing in front of perhaps his most notorious sculpture, which looks like nothing more than pieces of metal. At first, you might dismiss it as not very important, but what you're seeing there is 150 tons worth of steel rods, buildings that were destroyed in the 2008 earthquakes that destroyed so many buildings and took so many lives in Sichuan, in China. And his team not only collected these, but were able to hammer them, heat and hammer and straighten them back out as if to take and present them as a single piece of sculpture. It's really kind of art that is about political experience and about humanity. So, is going to change our opinion? Are we going to love every piece that we see? Are we going to understand every piece that we see? Of course not. Is it perhaps more important now in the 21st century for us to think about the context of the piece, the place it came from, the life story of the person who made it, in order to understand perhaps even more than it has been in the past? Is it at least possible to think about us having a dialogue about art without be part of the art power base? We don't have an art academy that tells us this is good and this is bad. We do have an art market that tells us this is valuable and that these artists are able to be free to make statements, to make work with unusual materials and unusual ways that help to provide public dialogue.